The day my son graduated from medical school, I wasn't in the auditorium. Not because I couldn't make it, not because I was sick or traveling or had some emergency I couldn't get out of. I wasn't there because my son, the boy I raised alone after his mother left, the boy I worked double shifts at a loading dock for 16 years so he could have everything I didn't, had crossed my name off the guest list without telling me. I found out from a neighbor. She'd seen the graduation announcement on social media, a photo of my son in his white coat, grinning like the whole world was finally his. The caption said something about how proud he was, how he'd done it against all odds. His wife's family was in every picture, her parents, her 2 brothers, her grandmother, who apparently flew in from Phoenix for the occasion. I was nowhere in those photos. When I called him that evening, not even angry yet, just confused, he let it go to voicemail. His wife called me back instead. She told me it was a small ceremony, limited tickets, family only. I said, I am his family. She paused just long enough to make it sting, then said, we meant immediate family, Harold. I'm sure you understand. I didn't understand. I still don't. But I've had 2 years to sit with it, and I think I finally know what happened, and why, and what it cost my son when he found out who was actually paying for the life he thought he built on his own. My name is Harold Pruitt. I'm 63 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Knoxville, Tennessee, the same house I've owned since 1998. It's nothing fancy. The gutters need replacing. The back porch has a board that creaks no matter where you step. My truck is 11 years old and it runs fine, which is all I ask of it. I look like a man who never had money. That's by design. I learned a long time ago that money changes people, not just the people who have it, but the people around them. When my wife walked out in 2001, our son was 4 years old. She said I was going nowhere. She said I was going nowhere. She said I'd always be a dock worker. She took what she wanted from the house and moved 3 states away to be with a man who wore suits to dinner. I let her go. I didn't fight it. I kept my son. For the first few years, I was exactly what she said I was. Barely keeping up with rent, coupon clipping, buying clothes at Goodwill. My son, Ryder, never complained. He was a good kid. He understood early that we didn't have much, and he worked hard in school because he saw me working hard at the dock. What he didn't know, what I never told him, was that things had changed. In 2004, a man I'd worked with for years asked me if I wanted to go in on a small warehouse property with him just outside the city. He was getting older, didn't have anyone to leave it to, and he trusted me to run the operation while he handled the financing. I put in every dollar I'd saved. It was a gamble. It paid off. By 2009, I owned 2 properties outright. By 2014, 5. By the time Ryder started college, I had 11 commercial and residential properties across 3 counties, 2 of them fully paid off and generating rent every single month. I wasn't rich by any standard that would make the news, but I was comfortable, very comfortable. I never told Ryder. I paid for his college, but through a fund I'd set up in his name, structured so it looked like scholarships and grants. I didn't want him coasting. I didn't want him thinking there was a safety net so big he never had to try. I'd watched what happened to kids who grew up knowing the money was there. They stopped being hungry for anything. Ryder was hungry. I wanted to keep him that way. He got into medical school on his own merits. Full application, competitive as anything, acceptance letter from Vanderbilt. When he called me that night, I sat on the back porch in the dark and cried. I'm not embarrassed to admit that. 16 years of double shifts, and my boy was going to be a doctor. I thought at some point I'd tell him the truth. I kept pushing it back. There was never a right moment. Or maybe I was afraid of what would happen when the picture changed, when I stopped being the man who drove an old truck and started being the man who owned a dozen properties. I was afraid he'd look at me differently. As it turned out, I was afraid of the wrong thing. Ryder met his wife, Claudette, in his 2nd year medical school. She came from what I'd call a complicated kind of money, the kind that's mostly about appearances. Her father, a man named Whitmore, ran a real estate investment company in Nashville. Her mother organized charity galas for a living. They were polished people, nice enough to my face, but the kind of nice that never quite reached their eyes. The first time I met them, I drove my truck to Nashville and wore my good flannel shirt. I could tell by the way Claudette's mother looked at my truck that I'd already failed some kind of test. Ryder didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything to me. Over the next year, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name at the time. Ryder's calls got shorter. When I visited, there was always somewhere they needed to be. Claudette was pleasant but vague, the kind of person who answers questions with questions so you never know where you actually stand. I told myself it was normal. He was in medical school, working 60-hour weeks. He had a serious girlfriend and a new life. I didn't want to be the father who clung. But then small things started adding up. A cousin of mine ran into Ryder at a gas station in Nashville and mentioned it to me. Said Ryder had seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, changed the subject fast when my name came up. Said he introduced Claudette as his fiancée, but didn't mention having a father at all. I wrote it off. Maybe he just didn't want to get into a long conversation. Then I got a call from an old friend who'd heard through someone else that Ryder was engaged. Not a call from Ryder. Not a text. Not a message of any kind. I heard about my own son's engagement from somebody's second cousin at a church picnic. I called him. He answered. To his credit, he confirmed it. He said he'd been meaning to tell me things had been busy. He was sorry. He sounded like he was reading from a script. I asked him about the wedding. He said it was being planned. Nothing finalized yet. He'd keep me posted. I waited. I kept waiting. 3 months later, I got a card in the mail. Cream-colored envelope. Calligraphy on the front. My name and address in somebody's neat handwriting. Inside was a wedding invitation for Ryder James Pruitt and Claudette Annalise Whitmore. Below the formal text, in the corner, someone, Claudette I assumed, had written in blue pen, "Harold, we hope you can make it. There won't be a +1 available at your table." That was it. No phone call. No conversation. A card in the mail and a note that told me exactly where I ranked. I kept the card. I still have it somewhere. I keep it not out of bitterness, but because there's something clarifying about having a thing in writing. It tells you what words were chosen and what words weren't. The word Dad wasn't anywhere on that card. The wedding was at a venue outside Nashville, a renovated farmhouse property with a long gravel drive and white string lights in every tree. I know what it looked like because I saw the photos later. At the time, all I knew was that I drove 2 hours in my old truck, parked in the lot at the back, and walked up to the front entrance where a young man in a black vest was checking names off a clipboard. He found my name. Then he looked up with an expression I will never forget, not mean, just profoundly uncomfortable, and said, "Sir, I've been asked to let you know that your seat has been reassigned." I said, "Reassigned where?" He said, "I'm so sorry, sir. I was told to give you this." He handed me an envelope. Inside was a note card. On it, in Claudette's handwriting, were 6 words. "Please don't make today difficult, Harold." That was all. I stood there on that gravel drive for what felt like a long time. The music was already playing inside. I could hear people laughing. I could smell something good cooking. It was a warm October afternoon, the kind Tennessee does better than anywhere. My son was inside that building, about to get married, and his wife had sent someone to meet me at the door, with a note asking me not to make a scene. I thought about what I would do. I thought about it carefully. I put the note card back in the envelope. I folded the envelope and put it in my shirt pocket. I thanked the young man, who looked genuinely pained, and I told him none of this was his fault. Then I turned around, walked back to my truck, and drove home. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I drove 2 hours in complete silence, and when I got home, I sat in my driveway for a while before I went inside. Then I called my attorney. Now I want to be clear about something. I'm not a vindictive man. I've never done anything in my life purely out of spite. What I did next wasn't revenge. It was a decision. A quiet, deliberate decision about what I owed my son and what I didn't, and about what kind of relationship I was willing to accept going forward. My attorney is a woman named Pamela, and she has been handling my affairs for about 12 years. She's sharp and practical and never wastes words. When I called her that evening and told her what had happened, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would you like to do, Harold?" I told her. She took notes. The following Monday, she began the process of restructuring several things. First, the property I had put into a joint trust several years earlier, a mixed-use building on a main street in Knoxville that generated a reliable monthly income, was removed from the planned estate transfer I'd earmarked for Ryder. Second, a savings account I had maintained specifically for his benefit, which he didn't know existed, was redirected. Third, and most relevant to the immediate situation, the farmhouse venue where the wedding had taken place. I should explain that one. Whitmore, Claudette's father, had presented the venue as his gift to the couple. It was a grand gesture, the kind of thing designed to establish certain hierarchies early. What Whitmore didn't know, because my attorney had arranged it through a holding company years before any of this became personal, was that I was the silent investor behind the property management group that owned the venue outright. I hadn't planned it that way for any dramatic reason. It was simply a good investment. The venue had been on the market at the right time, the numbers made sense, and I bought it. That I ended up being the invisible landlord of my own son's wedding was the kind of coincidence that almost feels like a joke. I did not find it funny. What I did find when I looked at the contract Whitmore had signed for the venue rental was that there was a standard clause about the property owner's rights to revoke access under specific circumstances. Pamela found a legitimate basis to invoke it. One I won't detail here because it involves some dry legal language, but the short version is this. By Tuesday afternoon, the management company had sent formal notice to the Whitmore party that several promised services, the catering equipment, the overnight accommodations, a specific premium package they'd been invoiced for, but the invoice hadn't cleared, were being rolled back. I wasn't trying to ruin their honeymoon. I wasn't trying to create chaos. I simply stopped subsidizing a celebration I had been quietly asked to stay out of. The effect was more immediate than I expected. By Wednesday, Ryder called me, not to apologize. His voice was tight and he talked fast, the way he does when he's agitated. He said there'd been some kind of mix-up with the venue. Did I know anything about it? I said, "What kind of mix-up?" He said the management company had contacted his father-in-law about a billing dispute. Services were being withheld. His in-laws were furious. His wife was upset. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." There was a pause. Then he said, "Harold." He'd started calling me Harold sometime in the past year, and I'd let it go, but it still landed somewhere low in my chest every time. "Do you have something to do with this?" I said, "With what, exactly?" He said, "With the venue, the property company. I looked it up. The ownership structure goes through a holding company and nobody seems to know who's actually." "Ryder," I said, "I think we need to have a conversation that's long overdue. Can you come to Knoxville this weekend?" He came on Saturday. Alone. Claudette stayed in Nashville, which told me something. He sat at my kitchen table. The same table where he'd done homework every night for 12 years. The same table where I'd helped him with biology in 8th grade until 2 in the morning. The same table where he'd cried after his first bad college exam. And I told him everything. I told him about the warehouse deal in 2004. About the properties. About the fund I'd set up for his education. About the holding company. About the venue. I told him slowly and clearly, the way I would have told him anything important. I didn't perform it. I didn't make it a speech. I just talked. He didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I was raising a doctor, not an heir." He looked at the table. He said, "That wasn't your call to make." I said, "Maybe not, but this is." I slid a single piece of paper across the table, a summary Pamela had put together, showing the accounts and assets that had previously been designated for him and their current status. "Everything I had set aside for you is still mine. I haven't given any of it away. I'm not angry. I'm just clarifying what kind of relationship we actually have." He looked at the paper for a long time. His jaw was working. Then he said, "Claudette didn't mean it the way it came across." I said, Your wife sent a man to the door of your wedding to hand me a note asking me not to cause trouble. I had driven 2 hours to watch you get married. I was not going to cause trouble. I had never, in your entire life, caused you trouble. I had never, in your entire life, caused you trouble. I paused. What did you think was going to happen when I found out? He didn't have an answer. I said, I'm not asking you to leave your wife. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to understand that being your father is not the same as being an inconvenience to be managed. What I didn't know then, what came out over the following months, was that Claudette's family had a problem. Whitmore's company had been under a quiet investigation for about 18 months. It was the kind of thing that doesn't make news until it does. Some of his investment vehicles had been structured in ways that regulators were finding hard to look past. Not fraud exactly, but close enough that several of his major clients had begun withdrawing, and the cash flow situation was becoming uncomfortable. I found out through Pamela, who had a colleague tangentially involved. I didn't go looking for it. It arrived the way bad news often does. Sideways, through someone who mentioned it, assuming I already knew. What it meant, practically, was that the Whitmore family's financial stability was considerably less solid than they'd presented. The grand gestures, the wedding venue, the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon, had been financed on credit and expectation. When my property management company pulled the premium services, it triggered a late payment flag on Whitmore's account, which flagged other things, which, combined with the regulatory pressure, accelerated what was already becoming a difficult situation. I didn't cause Whitmore's problems. His problems were his problems. But I also didn't step in to help, which I might have done once, under different circumstances, if his daughter hadn't handed me a note card on a gravel driveway. Ryder called me in March, about 5 months after our kitchen table conversation. He called early on a Sunday morning, which is unusual for him. His voice was different. Not agitated. Tired. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you." It was the first time he'd called me Dad in over a year. I said, "I'm here." He said he'd found out some things about Claudette's family. That the financial situation was worse than he'd known. That some of the promises that had been made, a down payment on a house, a loan to help get his private practice started, were not going to materialize the way he'd been told. He said, "I think I was sold a version of things that wasn't accurate." I didn't say anything. He said, "I also think I treated you badly. For a long time. Not just the wedding. For a while before that." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't have an excuse." I said, "I know." We talked for almost 2 hours, not about money, about everything else, about his mother leaving, about the years it was just the two of us, about the biology homework and the bad college exam, and the night before he left for medical school when we sat on the same back porch, and I told him he was going to do something I never could, and I meant it in the best possible way. He cried at some point. I'm not going to say exactly when. I want to be honest about where things stand because stories like this get tied up too neatly sometimes, and that's not how it actually goes. Ryder and Claudette are still married. I think he loves her. I think she's a more complicated person than she appeared in that first year, shaped by parents who used money to establish control and called it love. I've met her 3 times since the wedding. She was polite. I was polite. We are both, I think, waiting to see who the other person actually is. She has not apologized for the note card. I haven't brought it up. Ryder comes to Knoxville once a month now, usually on a Saturday, usually alone. We sit at the kitchen table or on the back porch and we talk, sometimes about nothing much, sometimes about things that were left unsaid for years. I haven't restored the trust or the accounts. Pamela says I don't have to decide anything right now, and she's right. That money will still be there, so will I. Whitmore's company settled with the regulators last fall. He's still operating, smaller and quieter. I wish him no harm. He's just a man who built a version of himself that turned out to be expensive to maintain. I think about that sometimes, about the versions of ourselves we build. I built mine around a truck and a flannel shirt and a property portfolio nobody knew about. Ryder built his around a future he thought was already constructed and waiting for him. We're both having to figure out what's real. The last time Ryder was here, he was standing at the back door getting ready to leave, and he looked out at the yard. The same yard where I pushed him on a tire swing in 1999, where he'd learned to ride a bike. Where we'd once dug up half the garden looking for a toy truck he'd buried as a 5-year-old and couldn't find. And he said, "I'm sorry, Dad, I really am." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Is that enough?" I said, "It's a start. It's a good start." He nodded. He put on his jacket. He walked out to his car and drove back to Nashville. I stood on that creaky back porch for a while after he left, listening to the neighborhood settle into evening. The gutters still need replacing. The board still creaks. The truck is still out front. Some things you fix when you're ready. Some things you leave a little broken on purpose because they remind you of something you don't want to forget. I loved my son through 16 years of double shifts, and I will love him through this too. That's not something I decided. It's just something that's true, the way certain things are true. Quietly, without ceremony, with no one around to hand you a notecard about it. I've thought a lot about what I did wrong as a father. Not the properties I hid, not the money I redirected. Those were decisions I stand behind. What I got wrong was simpler than that. I let silence do too much of the work for too long. I thought if I showed up consistently, every school night, every bad grade, every early morning, Ryder would understand without me having to say it out loud. That love doesn't need explaining. That sacrifice speaks for itself. It doesn't. I know that now. The thing about raising a child alone is that you get very good at enduring. You learn to carry things without putting them down, and eventually you forget what it feels like to set the weight down even for a moment. I carried the exhaustion, the financial worry, the loneliness of being the only adult in the house. And I carried it quietly because I didn't want Ryder to feel like a burden. But somewhere, in all that quiet carrying, I forgot to teach him what it looked like. I forgot to let him see me struggle so he could understand what it cost. That's on me. Not all of it, but some of it. What Ryder did. Letting himself be shaped by people who saw me as an obstacle to be managed. That came from somewhere too. It came from a young man who'd been handed a version of success and was afraid to look too closely at where it came from. That's not evil. That's a failure of honesty with yourself, and it's easier to fall into than most people think. Claudette's family offered him a story about who he was becoming, and he wanted to believe it. We all want to believe the flattering version of ourselves. But here's what I know about the way things actually work. After 63 years of watching them, who you are when no one's grading you is who you actually are. The choices you make when there's no audience, no applause, no one handing you a credential for it, those are the ones that accumulate into a life. Ryder spent years building something that looked strong from the outside and turned out to have nothing underneath it. That collapse wasn't bad luck. It was the natural result of decisions that had been made, quietly, over a long period of time. And the rebuilding. The Sunday morning phone call, the drive to Knoxville, the sitting at the kitchen table, and finally saying the true thing. That's the natural result of different decisions. Better ones. Ones that required him to be honest when it was uncomfortable, and to show up when he had no advantage in doing so. That's what I'd been trying to teach him all along, without ever quite saying it in words he could hear. I'm not a wise man in any formal sense. I never went past high school. I worked a loading dock for the better part of 2 decades. But I've learned that what holds a person together over time isn't talent or luck or who their people are. It's whether they tell the truth, whether they think clearly when they're under pressure, and whether they keep going when the easier thing would be to stop. Ryder is still learning that, so am I. That's enough. That's plenty, actually.